So, good morning. Very happy to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about cryptographic computing. In particular, artificial intelligence and the relationship between the two. So I want this to be super fun. If you have any questions, just stop me along the way. Kind of flag me down. And ask me any questions you guys have. So first, there was a few questions about, what is this sandbox? Why is this thing called the sandbox? Well, so everybody knows the definition number one, right? Thinking from kindergarten. But if you Google sandbox, actually number two in the verb here, it has to do with setting aside computer resources for a particular project, an experimental project, where maybe you don't know exactly what's going to happen, or maybe what happened might be something you don't want. You don't want to mess up your entire computer system, because maybe you're running some dangerous code. Maybe you're testing a virus. Maybe you're trying to design a virus for whatever reason. I hope not. But in designing antiviruses and the kind of things that you do, you have to ultimately do that. You have to kind of see what the capabilities are. And so you want to isolate a piece of software so it can only access certain things. This is also used in companies. A lot of companies now have sandboxes where they want to try something that's not inside their main business model. They want to explore a new capability, or they want to look at a new piece of technology that's maybe not part of their product line right now, but maybe in the future. And so that's developed inside what's called a sandbox. And so that's why this is called the Cindy and Reuben Gruber sandbox. And so that's where we are. And what I want to talk about today is cryptography. Obviously, you learned a lot about it this week. We're going to look at some of the simple codes if we get time at the end. But really, this goes back to the ancient world. I was surprised at how far back these technologies go. There's books on this subject from the year 1500. And that surprised me, that people have been thinking about codes and scrambling messages and hiding secrets for that long. And the book is a significant book, so that would suggest at the time it was already very well developed, and it kind of got turned into a sort of encyclopedia. And so the idea of hiding messages is really as old as language itself. And what's interesting about this, a lot of these concepts, is they're not always out in the open. These are very important secrets. And one of them, as you've, I'm sure, heard of, is Alan Turing. He came up with this idea during World War II for cracking codes. And I was watching a talk a few years ago, just a couple years ago, and they mentioned this idea of putting the codes onto pieces of paper and sliding them across each other in front of a light bulb. And then when the patterns would match up, it would shine brighter. And when the patterns didn't match up, not as much light came through. What was interesting to me is I didn't get to learn about this idea when I was in graduate school. Do you know why? It was still classified. So this is an idea from the 1940s that when I was studying cryptography just a few years ago, it still wasn't available to the public. And so it's interesting that when you go and look at a lot of these ideas, they're only now just becoming available. Some of the photographs like this have been classified since the 1940s, and the pictures of the computers themselves, some of them have only been classified in the last 5 years. So today I want to start with the idea of artificial intelligence, which I'm sure you hear this term a lot now. And there's nothing artificial about it. And whether it's real intelligence or not is kind of a question for the philosophers. And we have some in our sandbox here that love to debate that. But we're going to look at it from the point of view of reverse engineering, which is essentially what you're trying to do in cryptography itself. You're trying to see some data and see if there's a pattern in there. And for the last 100 years or so, neuroscientists have been trying to reverse engineer this system, in particular our visual system. And so that's what we're going to look at a bit today, is how did we design a computer program that acts like your eyeball? We take it for granted. You just open your eyes and you can understand what's in front of you. This world is very complicated in terms of the visual space, but for us it's very easy to make sense of it. It's only in the last decade or so that we've been able to create software that can mimic that technology. When I was your age, if you took a collection of photographs of cats and dogs and you shuffled them all up, there wasn't a computer on the planet that could unshuffle them. That's pretty surprising. That was a task you could do when you were this tall. You could easily say, this is a cat, this is a dog. But when I was your age, there was not a computer on the planet that could do that. So where do these ideas come from? Well, some of them actually go back all the way to 1850. A guy named Alfred Smee said, well, there's this new theory of electricity. Why don't we apply it to biology and see if we can use it to understand things like instinct and reason? And so he came up with this map. And in this map is what's now a very famous picture that today we call a neural network. And back in 1850, he already had the idea, and it's a little blurry, but this says skin, ear, and eye. And the idea was that signals from your eyeball, from your retina, go through this network of neurons and ultimately get processed and sent out to a muscle, which we can think of as having made a decision. That basic pattern of a neural network is now what I would argue is some of the most valuable and important technology on the planet right now. This is how ChatGPT works. This is how Tesla drives itself around. This is how medical data is being processed. And now as we're starting to see, it's going to form the new basis for cryptographic codes. John von Neumann, one of the most famous mathematicians of all time, he was looking at this same problem. And he said we might need a new kind of theory, a new kind of logic, where we look at the pattern of the brain cells themselves. And we might need a different kind of mathematics that's more like neuroscience. So one of the programs we have here at FAU is a program in brain science. And there's a new PhD in neuroscience. And one of the specializations that you can do in that is try to understand the systems components and to think of the brain like a circuit. In the 1950s, a guy named Frank Rosenblatt came up with this diagram. And he said, we have these things called electrons and protons and neutrons. He said, what about perception? What about perception, our ability to perceive the world? He said, we need a perceptron. We need an element that is the basic unit of how we make sense of our reality. And so he came up with this idea of a retinal circuit with these different association units and then finally a response. And it kind of looks like the Enigma machine if you were to open up the cross-wiring diagram. They have a very similar structure. He built this thing. This was called the Mark I perceptron. And it was a huge contraption, right? Almost bigger than this big display here. And all of this spaghetti string is all the wiring to connect the input where the light would come in, into the output that would try to decide what it was looking at. It's essentially a big glob of artificial neural tissue, a neural network. But it was very primitive. Right? Who remembers Sesame Street, brought to you by the letter C? That was the only problem it could do. Things that were so simple and very basic patterns. And you might recognize this. This is an old-fashioned camera that's digitizing that, turning it into electrical signals, and sending it through the big brain network. Here you can see the dots lighting up that form that C. And the idea here of pattern recognition. Can we determine what that pattern is? But the number of possible patterns, even for a simple problem like that, is like the number of possible codes. Right? Who's heard of the term brute force? Right? So when this problem is too difficult, you can't just brute force it. And that's the same thing with vision. There's too many possibilities, even when the image is very small. A few years after that, at Bell Laboratories and at IBM, a guy named Arthur Samuel, he's decided to set a machine that could learn on its own. This later became known as machine learning, which is a very important element and forms the basis for modern artificial intelligence. And he said, why don't we take a game, something like checkers, where we know what it means to win, but it's not exactly clear what you should do at each step. And so he set this computer up. You can see this computer took up a space the size of this room. And he set out to teach the machine how to play checkers. Now the amazing thing is when he was done, it could beat him at checkers. How do you do something like that? How do you write down the rules that'll be better than you? That's like hiding from yourself in hide-and-go-seek. Anywhere you would think to hide, you would also know to look there. And so that's what's really interesting about machine learning, is when we set these problems up, we can accomplish tasks that ahead of time we don't actually know how to do. You don't really know how your angles work. If you think too much about your ankles and toes when you go down the stairs, you'll probably fall down. It's something we just learned along the way. So, early cryptography, or the cryptography that's standard now, that's for the banking and all things like that, we have some plain text. We send it through some sort of encryption algorithm. It's a mathematical process that hopefully scrambles the data and changes it all around, spreads it all out. Then we get our ciphertext. That should be something that even if we leave it out at a bus stop and someone picks it up, they still wouldn't be able to understand what it is. And then at the other end, the important part is we're able to decrypt this and go back to our plain text. So cryptography in some sense is about taking patterns and turning them into what looks like randomness. Machine learning is about taking what looks like randomness in the world and turning it into patterns. And so in some sense, we can think of learning and cryptography as sort of duals of each other. Now we're starting to see this idea of machine translation. You see this now with ChatGPT. You can ask it in any language. You can go to the different translator apps, and they often now work in real time. This is something people just dreamed of a few decades ago. And this ability to say, this is English, and this is Japanese, and this is Korean, and give it all into one box, and have it sort out what the language is exactly the type of thing that cryptographers try to do. When we do cryptanalysis, all we have is a strange alien language. And we try to figure out what are the patterns in here, and how can we map this back to something meaningful. And we can do that a couple different ways. We can try to do codes, or we can try to have a custom language. Who's heard of the wind talkers? So in World War II, there was another idea about how to create a secret message system. And the idea was to use the Native American language of Navajo. Because the native speakers of Navajo were almost entirely concentrated in the United States. It was very difficult for people in other countries to find the Navajo speaker. And so what they would do is they would use words in Navajo, like the word for turtle would be used for the word for tank. And then they could just go on the radio and speak in Navajo. And the idea was that all the adversaries in different countries, they can't get access to those native speakers. And so they can create a custom language. And so that's one of the possibilities that AI is going to be able to do now, is to create its own custom language so that you can be sure you have a secret code system. One of the interesting developments that came out a few years ago was this idea of learning to protect communications. Rather than sitting down ahead of time and coming up with a mathematical formula, can we, like the checkers game, teach the system to hide the codes? Sort of like hide-and-go-seek with itself, where in a cat and mouse scenario, we have Alice and Bob and then some eavesdropper. Can we have this thing work together to try to create its own cryptographic code? And I think that's an interesting direction that y'all should consider as you start looking at research. So what has changed so much to make all of these things possible? Well, if we go back to the year I was born, this was the fastest computer on the planet at the time. It was NASA's digital wind tunnel, and they used it to design the space shuttle. It cost $16 million in today's money, and it had 256 megabytes of memory. Who's heard of a Raspberry Pi? You've probably used one. Who's used one? If you've used one, or if you've used your telephone, you've used a computer significantly more powerful than the fastest computer in the world. The types of problems that people were looking at the time, like thermodynamics and turbulence and, of course, cryptography, we still have a lot of those problems. But now you have access to supercomputers that can enable you to run these things very, very inexpensively. A few decades ago, artificial intelligence was called expert system. And the idea was that you would put as much knowledge as you knew about the problem into a sort of a database, and it could try things one after the other. But it's what AI scientists call brittle, in that it could follow certain instructions, but if it got lost even just a little bit, it didn't know what to do next. It would get stuck very easily and very often. I don't have to ask if you've all used ChatGPT, I'm sure you have. And as you know, it's very resourceful. If it doesn't give you what you want, you can say, try it again, or do this a different way, or start from the beginning. And if you haven't tried that, ask it to do so. It's interesting when you can say, start over. You can say, start over from scratch, and so on. This device on the right, has anyone ever heard of this thing called the flipper? Yeah, what is it?
It's technically like a remote for everything.
And what can it do though?
Like you just walk into like a Walmart or something, and it can like turn on and off the TVs, change channels, turn off lights.
Effectively without the permission of those devices, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And so the idea is that it can hack. That this thing is like a Tamagotchi, or, well, that's probably before your time. It's a little video game, and what's interesting is it has an agent-based interface. There's a sort of a little cybernetic dolphin here. And you communicate to this thing in English, like you would talk to a Mario character in Nintendo. And you ask it to do things. And you can say, get the Wi-Fi password, or you can grab credit card numbers and all kinds of things that I certainly don't recommend you do. But what's interesting is this device doesn't really have AI on it yet. It's still this version of AI from the 1980s called an expert system. It has a big laundry list of things it knows how to do, and it will try them one after the other. And if it gets to the end of the list, it'll kind of just give up. But the next generation of this technology that you'll see probably in a year or so will have the equivalent of ChatGPT built into it, and it will be able to try again. It will be able to go out to the internet and look up documentation. It'll be able to read the user manual. It'll be able to try new things. Ultimately, it'll be able to go out and ask humans for help, whatever it might be. And so these are the kinds of things that I think you guys should be thinking about as cryptographers and security experts. How do we make sure that the lights are under our control, right? If it's your TV, you want to make sure that someone else isn't coming through and driving and clicking it as they go by. What's really interesting is to look at the pace of progress with this technology over the decades. And so this is a graph here. You can see down here, this says Los Alamos, right? Who's heard of Los Alamos? Los Alamos is where they built the atomic bomb. It's one of our most important and secure computing and research facilities in the country. And it's interesting that they have been looking at this problem for some time now. And they actually made this graph back in 1998. And what they did is they said, let's take a data science approach to how technology has been evolving. So down here on this axis we have the year. It goes from 1900 to at the time they applied it to 2020. And on this scale, it says MIPS. And MIPS stands for 1 million instructions per second. So basically, how many math problems can your computer do in 1 second. And if we go down here, we have the hand calculators. These are old-fashioned machines with metal, like with a big crank, right? They use them in banks and stuff and cash registers, and they can do mathematics, but very slow, right? And it wasn't until the mid-1980s, I'm sure you've heard of the Apple Macintosh. That was the one that Steve Jobs developed. And that was the first computer at the time that could do 1 million calculations for only $1,000. So this is MIPS per $1,000. So the idea is your company says to you, here's a budget of $1,000, please go buy the fastest computer you can, and let me know how many math problems a second it can do. And if you can do 1 million problems a second, then your computer can have a drawing program, and play music, and have icons, and click on it. And that was the first time that we had a user interface to a computer. But what's interesting is they plotted all the very famous computers, like the ENIAC that von Neumann worked on, or the Colossus that Turing worked on, or Konrad Zuse built one of the first mechanical computers. And they plotted all of these computers along the way, and then they drew trend lines. And they tried to predict. But what's interesting is on this axis, they estimated how many calculations you need to simulate the workings of a bacteria, or an earthworm, or a spider, or a lizard, or a mouse, a monkey, or a human. And what's interesting is if we take this trend line out, and we go out to 2024, we are exactly where, in fact, we're ahead of the dots. These dots created the NVIDIA you've heard of, and this is the Langle computer at Los Alamos. These dots are actually above the prediction. Computers got faster than people had even thought or hoped. And what does that mean? It means that it's suspected, and we're starting to see this now, that we can simulate the kind of processes that happen in the human brain. And that's why things like ChatGPT have emerged in the last few years. Right on time. A lot of people are surprised by AI, but if we look at this graph, we shouldn't be surprised at all. Sort of right on schedule. What will that look like in the next 10 years? That's kind of surprising. So this is this branch of things used to be called neurocomputing. And I think there's an interesting overlap here in something called natural computing, which is one of the things that we study here in the Sandbox. And there's a sort of a bunch of things that come together. And the idea is that we need to look at nature to figure out how computation works. What's happening in the blade of grass, what's happening with seagulls as they search the beach for food. Who's ever made the mistake of giving a seagull a french fry? Right? And then what happens? They all come out of nowhere. They have the entire ocean to look for food. How do they know to show up at your picnic? Right? Same with ants in Florida and so on. And so this kind of computing that nature does all the time is things that we need inspiration from. A few decades ago, people said, well, we probably don't need that. But it was so successful to look at the brain and to look at these neural networks that now the idea is that we need to go and look at, well, how do friend groups form with social computing? How does physics actually compute? Right? If we go like this, that's computing the sound that it just made. It's not a very interesting computation, but we can think of it as there was an input and there was an output in terms of the sound. Developmental computing. How do we actually form the structures that we have? How do you take an acorn and get an oak tree out of it? How do you take a human cell and get a full physiology? There's a lot that we need to learn there. On the other scale, with evolution, how do these things happen along the way, right? And one that I think is particularly interesting is immunocomputing, looking at our immune system. Your immune system is very intelligent. Who's had chicken pox? Right? Your body remembers. I don't know people that have. Your body remembers that you've had chicken pox. Right? And in there, if you ever encounter that again, your body remembers the solution and it can pull that out of its memory and use that to help fix it. And so it's a very interesting system, kind of like the brain, but has very different properties. And so there's a few things I wanted to kind of just touch upon. Maybe we'll run some demos if we get enough time. And one of them is this idea of multi-party computation. Has anyone heard of this one yet? It's an idea of how do you split up a problem into a bunch of little pieces such that you can have people participate on the problem but not actually know what they're working on. This was actually done in practice, again during World War II, when people were working on the atomic bomb project, largely at Los Alamos. They were able to split that problem up into so many little pieces that most of the people helping on what's now called the Manhattan Project did not know what they were helping with. They split the problem into little pieces, and they would say, all right, here's a dial, and here's a little wheel, and when it goes this way, turn it that way, when it goes that way, turn it this way. And they'd say, okay, glad to be helping. And they had no idea that they were helping diffuse uranium. And so the idea is you can take a big, complicated problem and split it up into little pieces, such that the actual problem itself stays a secret, but you can still get the answer. One of the examples is what's called the millionaire problem, right? So imagine me and Anand are both millionaires, and we want to know who has more money. But we don't actually want to say how much we have, but we want the answer. And so in that case, the problem is greater than, right? Very simple math problem. But we want to figure out that greater than A, greater than B, true or false. But we don't actually want to disclose what A and B are. And so that's an example of cryptographic computing, doing a computation on inputs where we don't actually have the inputs in an obvious way. They're sort of broken up into little pieces so that we don't actually know what they are. But then we can actually figure out in the end who has more money, or which person has a bigger salary, or whatever it might be. And this has a lot of applications in things like healthcare. You want to be able to answer questions about medical data, but you don't want to disclose anything that might be considered private. So here's an example of this. Say we want to compute the average salary, right? You're joining a startup company, and you want to make sure everything's fair. And so you can say, well, how much do you get paid? How much do you get paid? What's the average? So what we can do is Ada here will take their salary, and they'll add just some giant random number to it. And they'll just make that up, right? And then they'll pass it on to Satoshi, and they'll add their salary to the running total. And they'll pass it along to Grace, and she'll add her salary, and Bill will add his, and they'll pass this along. And everybody adds their salary to the running total. And Ada will get back this number, this X6, which is everybody's salary added together, and she added that initial value that she put on in the beginning. Now, only Ada knows what that one is, and she doesn't know what the other values were along the way. So all Ada needs to do is subtract out that initial number, divide by 6, and she gets the average salary, but she doesn't know the salary of any of the participants. And so this is an example of multi-party computation, where you split the problem up into a bunch of little pieces, and you've calculated a function, in this case the average, without actually disclosing what any of the individual inputs were. The holy grail of this idea is sort of it's this idea of fully homomorphic encryption, right? And so this means you have the same form, right? It's fully of the same form. And the idea is being able to have a computer program that operates on scrambled data. So imagine you have some healthcare information. Could be a brain scan, could be some blood work, could be your medical history, the whole thing. And what you want to do is you want to send it out to the cloud to give you an answer. Right? Am I healthy? But you don't want to have to trust the cloud. You don't necessarily trust Amazon with your data. You don't necessarily trust whatever company it is might be processing your information. But you want the answer back. So what you do is you take your medical data, your brain scan, let's say, and you encrypt it. You scramble it up. And you give it to the AI provider Amazon, IBM, whatever it might be. But you don't give them the key. They can't look at the data directly. But they can process some function on it. The function being, am I healthy? They will be able to, when this technology is developed, it's just in the early stages now, you would be able to get back that answer, and the answer itself is also locked up. And you get back a scrambled answer, and then you have the original key. You can unlock the answer and you can get back. Yeah?
I have a question on the past slide.
Yeah.
So what if they, like, if Satoshi got Ada's salary, or if Grace got Satoshi's salary, wouldn't they be able to see the past person's salary to be able to add their own and then pass it on?
Well, you sort of pass it in one direction. So if Satoshi got it, they can't know what Ada's salary is because they don't know what this random value was. And if Grace gets it, all they would get would be these two already mixed with that one in there. And so you want to send it in one direction, and in any one spot, it's not clear where it came from. Right? And you wouldn't necessarily know how many people were ahead of you anyway. In a sense. But great question. So now I want to talk about the idea of attacking these AI systems and why we need cryptography to do the kind of privacy preserving functions like we just mentioned, but also to protect these AI models, as they're called, from things like these different kinds of attacks. One of them is called a training data extraction. And so imagine we have a face recognition camera. If you fly in the airports nowadays, they're all over the place. Imagine we had one at the front of the Sandbox here. And it has in there a model, a mathematical, essentially a mathematical contraption that is taking in an input of the camera and deciding, is this a member of the Sandbox? But inside that mathematical model, which is essentially a big parameterized formula, inside that is your face. Not exactly the original photograph, but it has to have some representation of you, otherwise you wouldn't be able to answer the question. And so the idea is if you wanted to do an attack on, is this person a member of the Sandbox, and I get access to the facial recognition camera, I could test it to see whether or not you're actually a member of the Sandbox. And for things like healthcare, and if you're doing a brain scan to know if someone has Alzheimer's, this has important privacy considerations. You can see if someone is a member of that network or not. So like with the hacker, the Flipper Zero, we're going to see an emerging threat of a lot of hackers using AI to attack a lot of systems at once. Hacking is very highly skilled labor. It's very difficult. It takes a long time to learn it. You've got to take a lot of boot camps to learn how to do these kinds of things. But now, with AI, one person, rather than trying to attack one laptop at a time, they can use AI tools to go out and attack lots of laptops at once. This is why we need things like the immune system on our computers and on our computer networks to protect us from that. As we discussed, the immune system is very good at this. A single drop of seawater has over 1 million viruses in it. Seawater doesn't hurt you. It's actually quite good for you to swim in the ocean. How is our body able to handle that kind of continuous attack at scales like that? That's the kind of technology we need in our computing systems. One of the attacks that we're seeing now is what's called adversarial inputs. Poisonous data that you can give to a network. So, like we saw back in the 50s, looking at the big letter C, these technologies have gotten very advanced now in the last few years. And now they can very easily tell you this is a line, a race car, and a traffic light by sending the information through these large networks and getting the answer on the other side. But if I can go through as a hacker, as an adversary, and I have access to these images and I can change them just a little bit, you can see they're slightly different. Here's a minus sign, so these are the differences between the original and the final, which is a very, very small difference. We're just changing a few pixels here and there. and I send those new images to the network, it now thinks that's a pelican, a speedboat, and a pair of jeans. That means you can crash someone's Tesla. That means you can attack someone's healthcare network. That means someone can break into your smart doorknob or whatever it might be. How do we get the machine to realize this is not a regular picture, but it's a picture that's been attacked? How does your body know it's not just regular seawater, it's bad, or whatever it might be? How does it handle that kind of data input? So we take a picture like a stop sign, and we add just a little bit of this adversarial noise. And it doesn't have to look too strange. These stop signs would never confuse any human. But if we show a computer these stop signs, it no longer recognizes them. That little bit of graffiti and those black and white squares completely ruin the AI's ability to recognize it. We don't have anything quite like this in human perception, not that we're aware of. The best example I can think of is, well, you guys don't drive yet, but in the car, when there's a sort of a bright, like the sunshine at sunrise or sunset, and you sort of have to squint and put the visor down and put your glasses on, it can affect your ability to make driving decisions because there's too much bright light in one area. For the computer, this is just overwhelmingly glare. It's like, oh, now I can't see. Our vision system doesn't work that way. So we have to figure out why is our vision not perceptible to that kind of attack, and how can we prevent the computer from being vulnerable to that sort of thing. And so this is good open research that I encourage you to look up and look into as you move forward with your careers. Even if we move the stop sign around a little bit, it now thinks that's a speed limit sign instead of a stop sign. So one of the things that we can use to prevent this is a technology that I'm sure you've heard of. It's usually called Bitcoin. In general, it's called blockchain. And it's a cryptographic technology. It's a way of taking data and cryptography together and building this thing called a blockchain, where it becomes immutable. Right? You can't change any of the records. So that if you take a photograph, you can seal it up and store it in a way that if anybody changes it, you'd know. Is it easy to steal a Bitcoin? No. How much are Bitcoins worth? Collectively? A fortune. If someone were able to spend, let's say, $10 billion and could break the Bitcoin network, would that be worth it? Yeah. Because it's worth way more than that. And so as far as we know, no one knows how to crack that network. And so that's the kind of technology that we need to secure medical records, to secure your personal data, to secure banking, things like that. One of the technologies that you can do with this is what's called a smart contract. And so this uses cryptography to make buying and selling much easier, right? Traditionally, you sort of have to have sort of the exchange of the goods and services with a trusted third party. But what you can do is, if you have something that's digital, you can set this thing up as a contract, essentially as sort of a digital vending machine. And this is written as code with cryptography, and it's made available publicly. And there's a condition. The vending machine condition says, insert $1, receive 1 soda. And it's understood that that's what it's going to do. And as soon as the event happens, you automatically get the soda, assuming the machine is working. And so that's the kind of thing that we're going to see for buying a house, or renting a car, or even buying things online. And so these are very practical, everyday applications of cryptography that we're starting to see in the economy. So we started with this idea of cats and dogs, and how we couldn't sort them out. It was as difficult as cracking a code, telling the difference between pictures of cats and pictures of dogs. And it wasn't until about less than 10 years ago that we finally figured out the mathematics of how to make a machine that can sort out this data. But now we can run that in reverse, and we can generate fake images of cats and dogs. These aren't real, and if you look at them carefully, you might worry about these pets because they look a little funny. The ability to generate these in reverse is very recent, and it has extraordinary consequences. We've been talking about Los Alamos and the bomb. And when the nuclear explosion went off for the first time in World War II, it contaminated the entire planet with radiation. And all of the metal in the world got contaminated. But for certain scientific experiments and certain medical equipment, it's very important that the metal itself doesn't put out any radiation, because you're trying to measure something. You want to make sure that it doesn't have any activity itself. And so there's this idea of low background steel. That if you need to make a very sensitive piece of equipment, you have to have metal with no radiation in it. They actually go under the ocean and they bring up old battleships that sank in World War I. Because they've been under the ocean so long, they weren't contaminated by all the radiation. This is what's happening with data. All of the data in the world has now been contaminated with artificial pictures. We can now create deep fakes of anything in the world. Fake cats, fake dogs, fake people, fake sunsets, whatever it might be. Now what if you're a vision researcher or a photographer historian, say 10 years from now, and you're trying to do a research report, and you get a bunch of images. Are they real? How will you know? I went out and I asked Google to give me a picture of a penguin eating orange ice cream, and it said there are no matches. And so I went to the image search and I said penguin eating orange ice cream, and there were no matches of what I wanted to see. And then I asked the AI generator to generate a penguin eating orange ice cream. You can do it. So now in 10 years, if I see a picture of a penguin eating orange ice cream, how will I know if it's real? This is why we need cryptography. We need mathematical solutions for these kinds of problems. It should be as difficult to fake a picture as it is to steal a Bitcoin. We can generate sunsets, anything you want. We can pull up this before we break. You'll see some of these things running. There's another technology that we're going to need to use, and that's the idea of steganography. With cryptography, we try to make the message unreadable. With steganography, we try to make the message undetectable. Make it so it's not obvious there's a message at all. If people know you're sending a scrambled message, they'll try to descramble it. But if they don't know you sent a message at all, that adds a whole other layer of security. And so this is one of the things that we can use, the idea of creating a digital watermark. To look at every photograph and know who took that photograph, when, with what camera. Did they use an AI? If so, which one? I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I really hope you all continue your career. I think this is a very important space that you're working in. And as you can see, we need these technologies, not in the future, but we need them today. So if you want, we have just a few minutes left. I'd like to show you an example of this. And we can try to run this here. Let me turn on the code. And I'll provide the link so that you can try this yourself this afternoon. Easier to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to run an example of steganography. And we're going to load an apple and an orange. And I'm going to take a picture of an apple and a picture of an orange, and I'm going to hide one behind the other. This is an example of steganography. But we're not going to scramble the message, we're going to disguise it as something else. And so what we can do is we can look at these pixels. I'll send the link here so you can pull this up yourself on your laptops and try this. And if we zoom in, all of the brightness values for this, they're stored as numbers. And if you notice, there's sort of a lot of detail in the number. There's a lot of decimal places. And it turns out there's more than we need. If I were to change this 3 at the end to a 4, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference in that picture. It's like if you're going to buy something and they change it by 1 penny, then you might not notice. If you see on the gas stations at the end they have a fraction, and they say 9/10 or whatever. They're just trying to get a little bit extra money from you. Most people don't notice. They say, oh, another 9/10. What does that make a difference? And the idea is with these values, the brightness on the pixels for the apple and the orange, the computer stores so many decimal places that if we change the ones at the end, it won't affect our ability to see the difference. And so what we can do is we can go through and we can throw those extra values out. We can sort of get from one picture the last bits and from the other picture the first bits, and we'll sort of cut this thing in half. And so in this case I have 8 decimal places, 4 in the front and 4 in the back. But if I throw away the back 4, it won't change the picture. So what I'll do is I'll take a second picture and load it in as the back 4 digits, decimals there. And so we have 2 functions. One called hide, where you give it 2 images, and one called extract, where you give it the hidden image. And together we can turn that into a function called combine, where it'll hide the image, the apple and the orange. And so if I look at this picture, that has the orange in it. And if I take that picture and I run it through the extract, I get back the orange. And so this is how we can use this to hide the data and put information like, let's say, a medical record. Where did it come from? What doctor signed off on it? What patient is it? And we can hide that inside the image and have a record of where that data came from. Is it real? Is it fake? So let's do one more. We can take this picture of this rabbit, and we can take this picture of this hat. And you see where this is going to go? And we'll combine them, and ta-da, the rabbit's gone. But inside this image is everything we need to go back and pull out the rabbit. So I want you guys to try this. I'm not sure if you have time right now on the schedule, but I'm going to post the link here, and you guys can run this yourself this afternoon. Go get a couple pictures of the web, go get a picture of your friend, go get some silly meme or whatever, hide it there, and then you can uncover it later. Yeah?
Let's say you didn't know that the orange was behind the apple. Would you still be able to find the orange in the apple?
Only if you knew to look for it. Right? And that's the idea of steganography. Why would you suspect there's an orange there at all? That's the important part of not just scrambling the message, but hiding it. Another thing we could have done is we could have also scrambled the image. We could do encryption on the image, make it look just like pure static or pure noise, and then put that back there, and then we would have both. If anyone looks, they would find it. I've got one more that I think is really interesting in terms of cracking codes. And I like this one a lot because I like to cook. Does anybody like to cook, use recipes? What's really interesting is they made a data set of recipes from the internet with a photograph of what the final dish looks like. And they treated that like cryptography, like a code to be broken. And they said, if you have this list of ingredients, what would the food look like? And then what you can do is you can give it a list of things. And you can say, flour, sugar, skim milk, egg, vanilla extract, lemon peel, blueberry. And the real picture is this. And the model, sort of decrypting this as a code, is able to generate that picture. It says, oh, that's a blueberry muffin. here's what it probably looks like. And so it's really interesting to think of problems out there in data science, in healthcare, in medicine, in physics, in chemistry, like codes. Nature is the ultimate code, and as scientists, we have to go out and figure out how do we crack that code and figure out how nature works. Thank you again.